badly his kingdom was falling apart. But what he did know was that for him, the next 6 hours were make or break. He had one trump card to play. The peasants absolutely trusted Richard to do the right thing by them. They were wrong. The crunch meeting was make or break for both sides. It was arranged for later that day here on neutral ground outside the city walls. In 1381, it was a field by the monastery and hospital of St Bartholomew, Smithfield. Smithfield Meat Market grew up here outside the city walls. No one wanted the dirty business of butchery in the heart of the city. And Smithfield was also a place for dirty political deeds. A few years before, William Wallace, Braveheart, had been hung, drawn and quartered here. On the 15th, death was once again in the air. The peasants started to assemble late in the afternoon. They knew that the political future of England was theirs to grasp. The demonstrations I've been on in London have all tended to start pretty much the same. First of all, little rather desultory groups of people arrived, looking round, wondering what's going to happen, and then more and more people fill the square, until suddenly there's a sense that you actually occupy the place in a way that you never have before. Then someone arrives with all the banners and posters, and all of a sudden you've got an identity. But presumably they didn't have banners and posters in the 14th century.
Well, I think there's evidence that's suggesting they did.
In what way?
Modern academics are suggesting that they found evidence they're carrying the St George's flag, and that Richard, to indicate his assent to this, had given some of them permission to carry the royal standard.
The peasants may have had their 14th century equivalent of placards, but that's as far as the parallel with a demonstration goes. They were a far more formidable fighting force than a bunch of modern protesters. They had to be. Richard's men had state-of-the-art equipment. This guy would have been a bit more threatening than a copper in a riot shield, wouldn't he?
Absolutely. So the status quo guard, and we're 35 years into the 100 Years' War. These are men with real military experience. So a man clad in steel is an intimidating thing.
So what kind of weapons would the king's forces have had?
The predominant weapon of the period, of course, is the sword.
Yes.
So they'd have been armed with the sword. The sword can be used, obviously, to cut. You can thrust with, which you can cut with. You can use the other end as a hammer. You can use the crossguard as a hook. It's a very versatile fighting tool. They also would have had daggers. Daggers would be on both sides. Daggers are a wonderfully versatile weapon. Again, great somewhere like London, good for street fighting. Get in close, stab people in the shoulder, which has a particular resonance in this circumstance.
Yeah, but with this armour and the sword, surely the rebels would have easily been hammered.
Well, I think the important thing to remember with this rebellion is this was an armed rebellion, and in London there were two opposing forces, heavily armed. There was no inequality here.
So what did the rebels have?
Well, they had a variety of things. Obviously, they weren't all peasants in the way that people today think they were. But even if some of them were, the poorest man in the land can afford a stick. You can get a stick for free in the woods.
Is that much good, though?
Yeah. I could beat a man in armour with a stick.
Never.
First of all, I've got reach. His main job, he's got to get near me. I could have hit him 20 times then. If he's clever enough to get hold of my stick and comes in, I can use the stick to block with. Now I've got a wonderful lever. He's off balance, and I can hit him and hit him again. So a stick is very useful. But even if you're not a skilled person with a stick, even if you're somebody who hasn't done much but just has anger in your heart, you could do a lot of damage with that.
Oh, I think that's for me. That one's for me. Yeah, I like that. What about this? This is quite
Simple,
fierce, isn't it?
Agricultural tool. It's called a hedging bill. It's for trimming the hedges, laying the hedges, getting them neat. It's a weapon in its own right. But pop down to your local blacksmith and get him to spend 10 minutes in the forge and put a spike on it, and you can see, look, it's the same tool.
This is like the yeoman of the guard use nowadays.
Exactly. This with a spike on becomes the English military bill, and it was a classic weapon of the 100 Years' War. English billmen were famed the world over. And it's got reach, you can get to people on horseback, it's got power. Even simpler, you just need to take a scythe blade. So a scythe for reaping the corn, down to the blacksmith and put it on a long pole. Now you've got a devastating, awesome cutting weapon. So you've got the reach to scythe up at that knight sitting 6 foot high over his horse, or chop the horse.
What's this thing?
Well,
I have to say, this does look a bit Joey.
Joey, it's a flail. You've seen Bruce Lee movies?
Yeah.
And they have the nunchuckers.
Oh, yeah.
Two little short sticks.
Yeah.
And they do all that stuff and do all the things like that. That's because they use it to thresh the rice. What they did in Europe was they used this with a longer pole to thresh the wheat. So again, we're a few weeks away from harvest. The wheat is still green, but once that's golden brown, you need to thresh it. You need to separate the wheat from the chaff. So it's simply a tool. They do that on the floor to separate the wheat from the chaff. Stick some nails in it, and you've got a military weapon.
Blimey, I wouldn't like to be on the receiving end of that.
No. And even if you're wearing armour, then there's going to be a level where you get some blunt trauma.
Oh, let's have a go at that. And adding to this homegrown arsenal was the deadly firepower of the people's weapon, the longbow. 900 bows had been stolen from the tower the day before, and every peasant was trained to use one. So we've got two opposing armies bristling with weapons, nose to nose in the middle of London. Pretty scary thought.
Well, it's not quite in the middle of London, Tony. It's right on the outer edge of the city. Even now, today, it's right by the ring of steel that marks the sensitive inner core of the city.
Well, it's more like a ring of solid plastic now, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, but in 1381, it would have also been still very dramatic from the events of the revolt. Behind us, you'd have been able to see the ruins of one of the priories that the rebels had attacked, still burning away.
So why here?
I think because it was a controlled space where you could easily assemble the two sides in order to try and conduct some sort of negotiation.
How many rebels do you think there might have been?
Well, it's always difficult to say with numbers in 1381. We know that some rebels had left the city after the concessions at Mile End, but what we were left with at Smithfield was a recalcitrant, hardcore, almost like headbangers rebels. I guess there probably would be about 300 or 400 of them left by that stage.
And King's men?
Well, the king is likely to have had about 200 men with him, including bodyguards and his personal servants and his attendants. So they're really getting prepared for this encounter and probably quite concerned at this stage.
When you say prepared, what do you reckon their plan was?
Well, it's very difficult to work out, but it seems that there's some suggestion that the king's men might have expected some kind of trouble and may well have been planning for an armed encounter. Otherwise, they're probably concerned to see what Tyler is actually going to ask for at this second meeting.
So do you reckon the whole thing was actually a stitch-up?
Well, many people have said that. Really since the few days after the revolt, people have argued that this occasion may well have been set up as a sting against Tyler and the other rebels.
And what's your thought?
It's so difficult to tell, but one problem with this theory is that the king is quite exposed throughout the encounter and his life really is in danger at several points.
It's a real high-risk strategy. If it was a plot, if it was a conspiracy, they're taking an enormous risk, especially as they must have been aware that they were dealing with the toughest and the most recalcitrant of the rebels by that
Could have
stage.
been cock-up just as much as conspiracy.
It may well have been that, yeah.
This illustration is from Jean Froissart's History of the Revolt, written just 7 years after the event. It's the climactic showdown between Richard II and Wat Tyler. There's a complete hush. It's really tense. The archers have got their fingers on the bows, but Wat ambles up to the king in a familiar, relaxed way, shakes him by the hand. "Hello, brother," he says, and then he tells him what they want. Freedom, abolition of the aristocracy, apart from the king, abolition of the senior clergy, except for John Ball, who was going to be made the next Archbishop of Canterbury, local courts, local police forces to be run by the people themselves, and all the money that previously belonged to the bishops and the lords would now be divided up among the common people. And all the while, Wat was telling this to the king,